So let's move on to the next question, guys. In this question, we are given that we have to choose an integer n from integer 1 to 96. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 up to 96, 1 and 96 both are inclusive. We have to choose an integer n, right? And we have to tell the probability that n into n plus 1 into n plus 2 will be divisible by 8, right? So a little tricky question. So please be careful and watch out. So for example, we know that what are the possible options? The possible options are 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 95, 96, right? These are the possible integers from which we have to choose one number, right? Okay. So for example, let's choose a number, let's say 1. Let's choose 1, right? So if we choose 1, we have to tell n into n plus 1 into n plus 2. So n, which means 1, n plus 1, which is 1 plus 1, which is 2, into n plus 2, which is 1 plus 2, which is 3, right? N plus 1, n plus 2. What is this value? This value is 6, right? Is 6 divisible by 8? No, 6 is not divisible by 8. So let's cross this out, right? Now, for example, let's take 2. So if we take 2, what is this? N, which is 2, n plus 1, which is 3, n plus 2, which is 4, right? This comes out to be how much? 2 into 4, 8, 8 into 3, right? Or you can say 24. So this is definitely divisible by 8, right? Okay. Now let's talk about even numbers first. If you take 4, for example, if you take 4, what will this be? This will be n, which is 4, into n plus 1, which is 5, into n plus 2, which is 6, right? So if you see over here, whenever you take an even number, whenever you take an even number, right? So this will be even, n will be even because this is even, n will be even, n plus 1 will be odd, right? Whenever you add 1, n plus 1, if n is even, n plus 1 will be odd, and n plus 2 will again be even, right? So if you see, this is also even. So what we mean over here is that whenever you take any even number, for example, we took 2, or we take 4, or we take 6, or we take 8, right? The product of this will always be divisible by 8. For example, if you see over here, this is 6 into 4, 24 into 5. This is what? 24 into 5. And we know 24 is obviously divisible by 8. So this entire thing will be divisible by 8, right? Let's suppose, let's take some other value, maybe 12. We take another even number 12, right? So, so n plus 1, n plus 2. What is n? N is 12. What is n plus 1? N plus 1 is 13. What is n plus 2? N plus 2 is 14, right? So if you see over here, is this number divisible by 8? It is. Why? Because if you break down 12, you can write 12 as maybe 4 into 3. You can write 12 as 4 into 3, and you can write 14 as 2 into 7 into 13, right? So this is basically this. If you see 4 into 2, you get 8 over here. So if you divide this by 8, this is easily divisible, right? So what I mean over here is that if you have n plus 1, n plus 2, any even number you take, whether it is 2, whether it is 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, up till 96, for any even number, this will always be divisible by 8. I hope this makes pretty good sense. That is how you have to draw a pattern basically in the exam, right? So one thing is for sure, that for all the even numbers, n plus 1, n plus 2 will be divisible by 8. Now, how many even numbers are there from starting from 1 up till 96? There are 48 even numbers, right? I mean, it is pretty obvious, right? 2 into 48 is 96. 2 into 48 is 96. So there are total 48 even numbers, right? Okay. So we can write that there are 48 numbers which are divisible by 8, right? I hope all of this should make pretty good sense, right? So what I mean over here is that uh, there are 48 even numbers. So every even number in n plus 1, n plus 2 will be divisible by 8. I think this should be pretty clear by now, right? Every even number n, if n is an even number, this part will be divisible by 8, right? And how many even number are there? There are 48 even numbers from 1 to 96. I hope this is pretty basic, right? Because 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, you can calculate it, right? And like this, you will have 48 even numbers. 96 upon 2, which is 48, right? Okay. So total even numbers is equals to how much? 48. I hope this makes pretty good sense. Now tell me one thing more. For example, let's talk about odd numbers, right? So for most of the odd numbers, this will not be divisible by 8. For example, let's take 5, right? Let's take n to be 5. So what is n? N is 5 into n plus 1, which is 6, into n plus 2, which is 7, right? If you see, this is not divisible by 8, right? This is, again, if you divide this by 8, you can't divide. 2 4s are 8, 2 3s are 6, you're stuck. Basically, it is not divisible by 8, right? But if you look at it closely, there are some odd numbers for which this will be divisible. For example, if you take n to be 7, we know n plus 1 will be what? 8. So obviously, this will be divisible by 8, right? If you take n is equals to 15, so n plus 1 will be what? 16. So obviously 16 will be divisible by 8, right? So what we mean over here is that for all the odd numbers, so basically, what is the table of 8? This is 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48, all these things, right? So if you take one number less, for example 7, 15, 23, 31, 39, 47, and so on. If you take all these odd numbers will be divisible. Why? Because if you put 7, 7 plus 1 becomes 8. So obviously this will be divisible by 8. Let's suppose you take 47. So 47, 48. This is 47, this is 48. So obviously this into this into this. 48 divided by 8. This will be divisible. Right? So for all the odd numbers, which is 1 less than 8, basically, which is 1 less than the multiple of 8, those will be divisible. Right? So total how many numbers are there as such? This is 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48, 56, right? 64. Then you have what? 72, 80, 88, 96, right? So for example, you take this one, 96. You subtract 1, you get 95. So now if you put 95 over here, what do you get? You get 95 into 96 into 97 upon 8, right? If you put 95, so 95 into 96 into 97 upon 8. Obviously this is divisible because 8 12s are 96, right? So basically, for all these numbers 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 48, 56, 64, 72, 80, 88, 96, if you subtract 1 from them, 7, 15, 23, 31, 39, 47. And if you put n that number, that will be divisible, right? I hope this makes pretty good sense. So total how many numbers are there? 8, 12s and 96. The last number is 96, right? So 8, 16, 32, 8, 12s and 96. So there are 12 numbers. You can count also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there will be 12 such odd numbers: 7, 15, 23, 31, 39, 47, 55, 63, 71, 79, 87, 95. So there are 12 odd numbers for which this will be divisible by 8. I hope this makes pretty good sense, right? Okay. So the number of odd, so total odd numbers will be how many? 12. Total odd numbers for which this is divisible will be 12. I hope this is pretty clear, right? So then total how many numbers are there? Total will be 48 plus 12, which is 90, which is 60. So there are total 60 numbers from 1 to 96 for which n into n plus 1 into n plus 2 will be divisible by 8. I hope this makes pretty good sense. So what is the probability? The probability becomes 60 upon total, which is 96. I hope this should be clear. Now if we solve this, 6 tens are 6 on the 6th, 16, 2 5s are 2 8s are. This comes out to be 5 upon 8. So this is your final answer. The probability that n into n plus 1 into n plus 2 will be divisible by 8 for number from 1 to 96 will be 5 upon 8. So I hope this should be absolutely clear.